The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. $1.87. That was all. And 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied. 3 times Della counted it. $1.87. And the next day would be Christmas. There was clearly nothing left to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl. So Della did it, which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sniffles predominating. While the mistress of the home is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second, take a look at the home. A furnished flat at $8 per week. It did not exactly beggar description, but it certainly had that word on the lookout for the mendicancy squad. In the vestibule below was a letterbox into which no letter would go, and an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. Also appertaining thereunto was a card bearing the name Mr. James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity when its possessor was being paid $30 per week. Now, when the income was shrunk to $20, the letters of Dillingham looked blurred, as though they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest and unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which is all very good. Della finished her cry and attended to her cheeks with the powder rag. She stood by the window and looked out dully at a gray cat walking a gray fence in a gray backyard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She had been saving every penny she could for months, with this result. $20 a week doesn't go far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. They always are. Only $1.87 to buy a present for Jim. Her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him. Something fine and rare and sterling, something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor of being owned by Jim. There was a pier glass between the windows of the room. Perhaps you have seen a pier glass in an $8 bat. A very thin and very agile person may, by observing his reflection in a rapid sequence of longitudinal strips, obtain a fairly accurate conception of his looks. Della, being slender, had mastered the art. Suddenly she whirled from the window and stood before the glass. Her eyes were shining brilliantly, but her face had lost its color within 20 seconds. Rapidly she pulled down her hair and let it fall to its full length. Now, there were 2 possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs in which they both took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the air shaft, Della would have let her hair hang out of the window some day to dry, just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor, with all his treasures piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to see him pluck at his beard from envy. So now Della's beautiful hair fell about her, rippling and shining like a cascade of brown waters. It reached below her knee and made itself almost a garment for her. And then she did it up again nervously and quickly. Once she faltered for a minute and stood still while a tear or two splashed on the worn red carpet. On went her old brown jacket. On went her old brown hat. With a whirl of skirts and with the brilliant sparkle still in her eyes, she cluttered out of the door and down the stairs to the street. Where she stopped, the sign read, Madame Sofronie, hair goods of all kinds. 1/8 up Della ran and collected herself, panting. Madam, large, too white, chilly, hardly looked the Sofronie. Will you buy my hair? Asked Della. I buy hair, said Madam. Take your hat off, and let's have a sight at the looks of it. Down rippled the brown cascade. $20, said Madam, lifting the mass with a practiced hand. Give it to me quick, said Della. Oh, and the next 2 hours tripped by on rosy wings. Forget the hashed metaphor. She was ransacking the stores for Jim's present. She found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores, and she had turned all of them inside out. It was a platinum fob chain, simple and chaste in design, properly proclaiming its value by substance alone and not by meretricious ornamentation, as all good things should do. It was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. It was like him. Quietness and value, the description applied to both. $21 they took from her for it, and she hurried home with the 78 cents. With that chain on his watch, Jim might be properly anxious about the time in any company. Grand as the watch was, he sometimes looked at it on the sly on account of the old leather strap that he used in place of a chain. When Della reached home, her intoxication gave way a little to prudence and reason. She got out her curling irons and lighted the gas and went to work repairing the ravages made by generosity added to love, which is always a tremendous task, dear friends, a mammoth task. Within 40 minutes her head was covered with tiny, close-lying curls that made her look wonderfully like a truant schoolboy. She looked at her reflection in the mirror long, carefully, and critically. "If Jim doesn't kill me," she said to herself, "before he takes a second look at me, he'll say I look like a Coney Island chorus girl. But what could I do, oh? What could I do with $1.87? At 7 o'clock the coffee was made and the frying pan was on the back of the stove hot and ready to cook the chops. Jim was never late. Della doubled the fob chain in her hand and sat on the corner of the table near the door that he always entered. Then she heard his step on the stairway down on the first flight, and she turned white for just a moment. She had a habit of saying little silent prayers about the simplest everyday things, and now she whispered, "Please, God, make him think I am still pretty." The door opened and Jim stepped in and closed it. He looked thin and very serious. Poor fellow, he was only 22, and to be burdened with a family. He needed a new overcoat, and he was without gloves. Jim stepped inside the door, as immovable as a setter at the scent of quail. His eyes were fixed upon Della, and there was an expression in them that she could not read, and it terrified her. It was not anger, nor surprise, nor disapproval, nor horror, nor any of the sentiments that she had been prepared for. He simply stared at her fixedly with that peculiar expression on his face. Della wriggled off the table and went for him. "Jim, darling," she cried, "don't look at me that way. I had my hair cut off and sold it because I couldn't have lived through Christmas without giving you a present. It'll grow out again, you won't mind, will you? I just had to do it. My hair grows awfully fast. Say, Merry Christmas, Jim, and let's be happy. You don't know what a beautiful, nice gift I've got for you." "You've cut off your hair?" asked Jim, laboriously, as if he had not arrived at that patent fact yet, even after the hardest mental labor. "Cut it off and sold it," said Della. "Don't you like me just as well, anyhow? I'm me without my hair, ain't I?" Jim looked about the room curiously. "You say your hair is gone," he said, with an air almost of idiocy. "You needn't look for it," said Della. "It's sold. I tell you, sold and gone too. It's Christmas Eve, boy. Be good to me, for it went for you. Maybe the hairs of my head were numbered," she went on with a sudden serious sweetness, "but nobody could ever count my love for you. Shall I put the chops on, Jim?" Out of his trance, Jim seemed quickly to wake. He enfolded his Della. For 10 seconds let us regard with discreet scrutiny some inconsequential object in the other direction. $8 a week or $1 million a year, what is the difference? A mathematician or a wit would give you the wrong answer. The Magi brought valuable gifts, but that was not among them. This dark assertion will be illuminated later on. Jim drew a package from his overcoat pocket and threw it upon the table. "Don't make any mistake, Dell," he said, "about me. I don't think there's anything in the way of a haircut or a shave or a shampoo that could make me like my girl any less. But if you'll unwrap that package you may see why you had me going a while at first." White fingers and nimble tore at the string and paper, and then an ecstatic scream of joy, and then, alas, a quick feminine change to hysterical tears and wails, necessitating the immediate employment of all the comforting powers of the lord of the flat. For there lay the combs, the set of combs, side and back, that Della had worshipped for long in a Broadway window. Beautiful combs, pure tortoiseshell, with jeweled rims, just the shade to wear in the beautiful vanished hair. They were expensive combs, she knew, and her heart had simply craved and yearned over them without the least hope of possession. And now, they were hers, but the tresses that should have adorned the coveted adornments were gone. But she hugged them to her bosom, and at length she was able to look up with dim eyes and a smile and say, "My hair grows so fast, Jim." And then Della leaped up like a little singed cat and cried, "Oh, oh!" Jim had not yet seen his beautiful present. She held it out to him eagerly upon her open palm. The dull, precious metal seemed to flash with a reflection of her bright and ardent spirit. "Isn't it a dandy, Jim? I hunted all over town to find it. You'll have to look at the time 100 times a day now. Give me your watch. I want to see how it looks on it." Instead of obeying, Jim tumbled down on the couch and put his hands under the back of his head and smiled. "Dell," said he, "let's put our Christmas presents away and keep him a while. They're too nice to use just at present. I sold the watch to get the money to buy your combs. And now suppose you put the chops on." The Magi, as you know, were wise men, wonderfully wise men who brought gifts to the babe in the manger. They invented the art of giving Christmas presents. Being wise, their gifts were no doubt wise ones, possibly bearing the privilege of exchange in case of duplication. And here I have lamely related to you the uneventful chronicle of two foolish children in a flat who most unwisely sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house. But in a last word to the wise of these days, let it be said that of all who give gifts these two were the wisest. Of all who give and receive gifts, such as they are wisest. Everywhere they are wisest. They are the Magi. The Furnished Room, by O. Henry. Restless, shifting, fugacious as time itself is a certain vast bulk of the population of the red brick district of the Lower West Side. Homeless, they have 100 homes. They flit from furnished room to furnished room, transients forever, transients in abode, transients in heart and mind. They sing home, sweet home, in ragtime. They carry their Laura's et penates in a bandbox. Their vine is entwined about a picture hat. A rubber plant is their fig tree. Hence the houses of this district, having had 1,000 dwellers, should have 1,000 tales to tell, mostly dull ones, no doubt. But it would be strange if there could not be found a ghost or two in the wake of all these vagrant guests. One evening after dark, a young man prowled among these crumbling red mansions, ringing their bells. At the 12th, he rested his lean hand baggage upon the step and wiped the dust from his hatband and forehead. The bell sounded faint and far away in some remote, hollow depths. To the door of this, the 12th house whose bell he had rung, came a housekeeper who made him think of an unwholesome, surfeited worm that had eaten its nut to a hollow shell and now sought to fill the vacancy with edible lodgers. He asked if there was a room to let. "Come in," said the housekeeper. Her voice came from her throat. Her throat seemed lined with fur. "I have the 3rd floor back, vacant since a week back. Should you wish to look at it?" The young man followed her up the stairs. A faint light from no particular source mitigated the shadows of the halls. They trod noiselessly upon a stair carpet that its own loom would have forsworn. It seemed to have become vegetable, to have degenerated in that rank, sunless air to lush lichen or spreading moss that grew in patches to the staircase and was viscid under the foot like organic matter. At each turn of the stairs were vacant niches in the wall. Perhaps plants had once been set within them. If so, they had died in that foul and tainted air. It may be that statues of the saints had stood there, but it was not difficult to conceive that imps and devils had dragged them forth in the darkness and down to the unholy depths of some furnished pit below. "This is the room," said the housekeeper, from her furry throat. "It's a nice room. It ain't often vacant. I had some most elegant people in it last summer, no trouble at all, and paid in advance to the minute. The water's at the end of the hall. Sprowls and Mooney kept it 3 months. They done a vaudeville sketch. Miss Bretta Sprowls, you may have heard of her, oh, that was just the stage names. Right there over the dresser is where the marriage certificate hung, framed. The gas is here, and you see there is plenty of closet room. It's a room everybody likes. It never stays idle long." "Do you have many theatrical people rooming here?" asked the young man. "They comes and goes. A good proportion of my lodgers is connected with the theaters. Yes, sir, this is the theatrical district. Actor people never stays long anywhere. I get my share. Yes, they comes and they goes. He engaged the room, paying for a week in advance. He was tired, he said, and would take possession at once. He counted out the money. The room had been made ready, she said, even to towels and water. As the housekeeper moved away, he put, for the thousandth time, the question that he carried at the end of his tongue. A young girl, Miss Vashner, Miss Eloise Vashner, do you remember such a one among your lodgers? She would be singing on the stage, most likely. A fair girl, of medium height and slender, with reddish, gold hair and a dark mole near her left eyebrow. No, I don't remember the name. Them stage people has names they change as often as their rooms. They comes and they goes. No, I don't call that one to mind. No, always no. 5 months of ceaseless interrogation and the inevitable negative. So much time spent by day in questioning managers, agents, schools, and choruses. By night among the audiences of theaters from all-star casts down to music halls so low that he dreaded to find what he most hoped for. He who had loved her best had tried to find her. He was sure that since her disappearance from home this great, water-girt city held her somewhere, but it was like a monstrous quicksand, shifting its particles constantly, with no foundation, its upper granules of today buried tomorrow in ooze and slime. The furnished room received its latest guest with a first glow of pseudo-hospitality, a hectic, haggard, perfunctory welcome like the specious smile of a demirep. The sophistical comfort came in reflected gleams from the decayed furniture, the ragged brocade upholstery of a couch and 2 chairs, a foot-wide cheap pier glass between the 2 windows, from 1 or 2 gilt picture frames and a brass bedstead in a corner. The guest reclined, inert, upon a chair, while the room, confused in speech as though it were an apartment in Babel, tried to discourse to him of its divers tenantry. A polychromatic rug like some brilliant flowered rectangular, tropical islet lay surrounded by a billowy sea of soiled matting. Upon the gay-papered wall were those pictures that pursue the homeless one from house to house, the Huguenot lovers, the first quarrel, the wedding breakfast, Psyche at the fountain. The mantel's chastely severe outline was ingloriously veiled behind some pert drapery drawn rakishly askew like the sashes of the Amazonian ballet. Upon it was some desolate flotsam cast aside by the rooms marooned when a lucky sail had borne them to a fresh-poured trifling vase or 2, pictures of actresses, a medicine bottle, some stray cards out of a deck. One by one, as the characters of a cryptograph become explicit, the little signs left by the furnished room's procession of guests developed a significance. The threadbare space in the rug in front of the dresser told that lovely woman had marched in the throng. Tiny fingerprints on the wall spoke of little prisoners trying to feel their way to sun and air. A splattered stain, raying like the shadow of a bursting bomb, witnessed where a hurled glass or bottle had splintered with its contents against the wall. Across the pier glass had been scrawled with a diamond in staggering letters the name Marie. It seemed that the succession of dwellers in the furnished room had turned in fury, perhaps tempted beyond forbearance by its garish coldness, and wreaked upon it their passions. The furniture was chipped and bruised. The couch, distorted by bursting springs, seemed a horrible monster that had been slain during the stress of some grotesque convulsion. Some more potent upheaval had cloven a great slice from the marble mantel. Each plank in the floor owned its particular cant and shriek as from a separate and individual agony. It seemed incredible that all this malice and injury had been wrought upon the room by those who had called it for a time their home, and yet it may have been the cheated home instinct surviving blindly, the resentful rage at false household gods that had kindled their wrath. A hut that is our own we can sweep and adorn and cherish. The young tenant in the chair allowed these thoughts to file, soft, shod, through his mind, while there drifted into the room furnished sounds and furnished scents. He heard in one room a tittering and incontinent, slack laughter. In others the monologue of a scold, the rattling of dice, a lullaby, and one crying dully. Above him a banjo tinkled with spirit. Doors banged somewhere. The elevated trains roared intermittently. A cat yowled miserably upon a back fence. And he breathed the breath of the house, a dank savor rather than a smell, a cold, musty effluvium as from underground vaults mingled with the reeking exhalations of linoleum and mildewed and rotten woodwork. Then, suddenly, as he rested there, the room was filled with the strong, sweet odor of mignonette. It came as upon a single buffet of wind with such sureness and fragrance and emphasis that it almost seemed a living visitant. And the man cried aloud, "What, dear?" as if he had been called, and sprang up and faced about. The rich odor clung to him and wrapped him around. He reached out his arms for it, all his senses for the time confused and commingled. How could one be peremptorily called by an odor? Surely it must have been a sound. But was it not the sound that had touched, that had caressed him? "She has been in this room," he cried, and he sprang to wrest from it a token, for he knew he would recognize the smallest thing that had belonged to her or that she had touched. This enveloping scent of mignonette, the odor that she had loved and made her own. Whence came it? The room had been but carelessly set in order. Scattered upon the flimsy dresser scarf were half a dozen hairpins, those discreet, indistinguishable friends of womankind, feminine of gender, infinite of mood and uncommunicative of tints. These he ignored, conscious of their triumphant lack of identity. Ransacking the drawers of the dresser, he came upon a discarded, tiny, ragged handkerchief. He pressed it to his face. It was racy and insolent with heliotrope. He hurled it to the floor. In another drawer he found odd buttons, a theater program, a pawnbroker's card, 2 lost marshmallows, a book on the divination of dreams. In the last was a woman's black satin hair bow, which halted him, poised between ice and fire. But the black satin hair bow also is femininity's demure, impersonal, common ornament, and tells no tales. And then he traversed the room like a hound on the scent, skimming the walls, considering the corners of the bulging matting on his hands and knees, rummaging mantel and tables, the curtains and hangs, the drunken cabinet in the corner, for a visible sign, unable to perceive that she was there beside, around, against, within, above him, clinging to him, wooing him, calling him so poignantly through the finer senses that even his grosser ones became cognizant of the call. Once again he answered loudly, "Yes, dear," and turned, wild-eyed, to gaze on vacancy, for he could not yet discern form and color and love and outstretched arms in the odor of mignonette. Oh God, whence that odor? And since when have odors had a voice to call? Thus he groped. He burrowed in crevices and corners, and found corks and cigarettes. These he passed in passive contempt. But once he found in a fold of the matting a half-smoked cigar, and this he ground beneath his heel with a green and trenchant oath. He sifted the room from end to end. He found dreary and ignoble small records of many a peripatetic tenant, but of her whom he sought, and who may have lodged there, and whose spirit seemed to hover there, he found no trace. And then he thought of the housekeeper. He ran from the haunted room downstairs into a door that showed a crack of light. She came out to his knock. He smothered his excitement as best he could. "Will you tell me, madam," he besought her, "who occupied the room I have before I came?" "Yes, sir. I can tell you again. 'Twas Sprowls and Mooney, as I said. Miss Bretta Sprowls it was in the theaters, but Mrs. Mooney she was. My house is well known for respectability. The marriage certificate hung, framed, on a nail over. What kind of a lady was Miss Sprowls in looks, I mean? Why, black-haired, sir, short and stout, with a comical face. They left a week ago Tuesday. And before they occupied it? Why, there was a single gentleman connected with the draying business. He left owing me a week. Before him was Mrs. Crowder and her 2 children, that stayed 4 months. And back of them was old Mr. Doyle, whose sons paid for him. He kept the room 6 months. That goes back a year, sir, and further I do not remember." He thanked her and crept back to his room. The room was dead. The essence that had vivified it was gone. The perfume of mignonette had departed. In its place was the old, stale odor of moldy house furniture, of atmosphere and storage. The ebbing of his hope drained his faith. He sat staring at the yellow, singing gaslight. Soon he walked to the bed and began to tear the sheets into strips. With the blade of his knife, he drove them tightly into every crevice around windows and door. When all was snug and taut, he turned out the light, turned the gas full on again, and laid himself gratefully upon the bed. It was Mrs. McCool's night to go with the can for beer, so she fetched it and sat with Mrs. Purdy in one of those subterranean retreats where housekeepers foregather and the worm dieth seldom. "I rented out my third floor back this evening," said Mrs. Purdy, across a fine circle of foam. "A young man took it. He went up to bed 2 hours ago." "Now, did ye, Mrs. Purdy, ma'am?" said Mrs. McCool, with intense admiration. "You do be a wonder for rentin' rooms of that kind. And did ye tell him then?" she concluded in a husky whisper, laden with mystery. "Rooms," said Mrs. Purdy, in her furriest tones, "are furnished for to rent. I did not tell him, Mrs. McCool." "'Tis right ye are, ma'am. 'Tis by renting rooms we kape alive. Ye have the raw sense for business, ma'am. There be many people will reject the rentin of a room if they be too to suicide has been after dyin' in the bed of it. As you say, we has our living to be making," remarked Mrs. Purdy. "Ease, ma'am, 'tis true. 'Tis just 1 week ago this day, I helped ye lay out the third floor, back. A pretty slip of a colleen she was to be killin' herself with the gases swate little face she had, Mrs. Purdy, ma'am." "She'd a been called handsome, as you say," said Mrs. Purdy, assenting but critical. "But for that mole she had a growin' by her left eyebrow. Do fill up your glass again, Mrs. McCool." The friendly call by O. Henry. When I used to sell hardware in the West, I often made a little town called Saltillo in Colorado. I was always certain of securing a small or a large order from Simon Bell, who kept a general store there. Bell was one of those 6-foot, low-voiced products formed from a union of the West and the South. I liked him. To look at him, you would think he should be robbing stagecoaches or juggling gold mines with both hands. But he would sell you a paper of tacks or a spool of thread with 10 times more patience and courtesy than any saleslady in a city department store. I had a twofold object in my last visit to Saltillo. One was to sell a bill of goods, the other to advise Bell of a chance that I knew of by which I was certain he could make a small fortune. In Mountain City, a town on the Union Pacific, 5 times larger than Saltillo, a mercantile firm was about to go to the wall. It had a lively and growing custom, but was on the edge of dissolution and ruin. Mismanagement and the gambling habits of one of the partners explained it. The condition of the firm was not yet public property. I had my knowledge of it from a private source. I knew that, if the ready cash were offered, the stock and goodwill could be bought for about 1/4 their value. On arriving in Saltillo, I went to Bell's store. He nodded to me, smiled his broad, lingering smile, went on leisurely selling some candy to a little girl, then came around the counter and shook hands. "Well," he said, his invariably preliminary jocosity fit every call I made, "I suppose you are out here making Kodak pictures of the mountains? It's the wrong time of the year to buy any hardware, of course." I told Bell about the bargain in Mountain City. If he wanted to take advantage of it, I would rather have missed a sale than have him overstocked in Saltillo. "It sounds good," he said, with enthusiasm. "I'd like to branch out and do a bigger business, and I'm obliged to you for mentioning it. But well, you come and stay at my house tonight and I'll think about it." It was then after sundown in time for the larger stores in Saltillo to close. The clerks and Bells put away their books, whirled the combination of the safe, put on their coats and hats and left for their homes. Bell padlocked the big, double wooden front doors, and we stood, for a moment, breathing the keen, fresh mountain air coming across the foothills. A big man walked down the street and stopped in front of the high porch of the store. His long, black mustache, black eyebrows, and curly black hair contrasted queerly with his light, pink complexion, which belonged, by rights, to a blonde. He was about 40 and wore a white vest, a white hat, a watch chain made of $5 gold pieces linked together, and a rather well-fitting 2-piece gray suit of the cut that college boys of 18 are wont to affect. He glanced at me distrustfully, and then at Bell with coldness and, I thought, something of enmity in his expression. "Well," asked Bell, as if he were addressing a stranger, "did you fix up that matter?" "Did I?" the man answered, in a resentful tone. "What do you suppose I've been here 2 weeks for? The business is to be settled tonight. Does that suit you, Or have you got something to kick about?" "It's all right," said Belle. "I knew you'd do it." "Of course you did," said the magnificent stranger. "Haven't I done it before?" "You have," admitted Belle. "And so have I. How do you find it at the hotel?" "Rocky grub. But I ain't kicking. Say, can you give me any pointers about managing that affair? It's my first deal in that line of business, you know." "No, I can't," answered Belle, after some thought. "I've tried all kinds of ways. You'll have to try some of your own." "Tried soft soap?" "Barrels of it." "Tried a saddle girth with a buckle on the end of it?" "Never none. Started to once, and here's what I got." Bill held out his right hand. Even in the deepening twilight, I could see on the back of it a long, white scar that might have been made by a claw or a knife or some sharp-edged tool. "Oh, well," said the florid man carelessly, "I'll know what to do later on." He walked away without another word. When he had gone 10 steps, he turned and called a bell. "You keep well out of the way when the goods are delivered, so there won't be any hitch in the business." "All right," answered Bell. "I'll attend to my end of the line." This talk was scarcely clear in its meaning to me, but as it did not concern me, I did not let it weigh upon my mind. But the singularity of the other man's appearance lingered with me for a while, and as we walked toward Bell's house, I remarked to him, "Your customer seems to be a surly kind of fellow, not one that you'd like to be snowed in with in a camp on a hunting trip." "He is that," assented Bell heartily. "He reminds me of a rattlesnake that's been poisoned by the bite of a tarantula." "He doesn't look like a citizen of Saltillo," I went on. "No," said Bell. "He lives in Sacramento. He's down here on a little business trip. His name is George Ringo, and he's been my best friend, in fact the only friend I ever had for 20 years. I was too surprised to make any further comment. Bell lived in a comfortable, plain, square, two-story white house on the edge of the little town. I waited in the parlor room, depressingly genteel, furnished with red plush, straw matting, looped-up lace curtains, and a glass case large enough to contain a mummy full of mineral specimens. While I waited, I heard, upstairs, that unmistakable sound instantly recognized the world over, a bickering woman's voice, rising as her anger and fury grew. I could hear, between the gusts, the temperate rumble of Bell's tones, striving to oil the troubled waters. The storm subsided soon, but not before I had heard the woman say, in a lower, concentrated tone, rather more carrying than her high-pitched railings, "This is the last time. I tell you, the last time. Oh, you will understand." The household seemed to consist of only Bell and his wife and a servant or two. I was introduced to Mrs. Bell at supper. At first sight she seemed to be a handsome woman, but I soon perceived that her charm had been spoiled. An uncontrolled petulance, I thought, and emotional egotism, an absence of poise, and a habitual dissatisfaction had marred her womanhood. During the meal, she showed that false gaiety, spurious kindliness, and reactionary softness that mark the woman addicted to tantrums. Withal, she was a woman who might be attractive to many men. After supper, Bell and I took our chairs outside, set them on the grass in the moonlight, and smoked. The full moon is a witch. In her light, truthful men dig up for you nuggets of purer gold, while liars squeeze out brighter colors from the tubes of their invention. I saw Bell's broad, slow smile come out upon his face and linger there. "I reckon you think George and me are a funny kind of friends," he said. "The fact is we never did take much interest in each other's company. But his idea and mine of what a friend should be was always synonymous, and we lived up to it, strict, all these years. Now, I'll give you an idea of what our idea is. A man don't need but one friend. The fellow who drinks your liquor and hangs around you, slapping you on the back and taking up your time, telling you how much he likes you, ain't a friend, even if you did play marbles at school and fish in the same creek with him. As long as you don't need a friend, one of that kind may answer. But a friend, to my mind, is one you can deal with on a strict reciprocity basis, like me and George have always done. A good many years ago, him and me was connected in a number of ways. We put our capital together and run a line of freight wagons in New Mexico, and we mined some and gambled a few. And then, we got into trouble of one or two kinds, and I reckon that got us on a better understandable basis than anything else did. unless it was the fact that we never had much personal use for each other's ways. George is the vainest man I ever see, and the biggest brag. He could blow the biggest geyser in the Yosemite Valley back into its hole with one whisper. I am a quiet man, and fond of studiousness and thought. The more we used to see each other, personally, the less we seemed to like to be together. If he ever had slapped me on the back and sniveled over me like I've seen men do to what they called their friends, I know I'd have had a rough and tumble with him on the spot. Same way with George. He hated my ways as bad as I did his. When we were mining, we lived in separate tents, so as not to intrude our obnoxiousness on each other. But after a long time, we begun to know each of us could depend on the other when we were in a pinch, up to his last dollar, word of honor or perjury, bullet, or drop of blood we had in the world. We never even spoke of it to each other, because that would have spoiled it. But we tried it out, time after time, until we came to know. I've grabbed my hat and jumped a freight and rode 200 miles to identify him when he was about to be hung by mistake, in Idaho, for a train robber. Once, I laid sick of typhoid in a tent in Texas, without a dollar or a change of clothes, and sent for George in Boise City. He came on the next train. The first thing he did before speaking to me was to hang up a little looking glass on the side of the tent and curl his mustache and rub some hair dye on his head. His hair is naturally a light reddish. Then he gave me the most scientific cussing I ever had and took off his coat. If you wasn't a Moses meek little Mary's lamb, you wouldn't have been took down this way, says he. Haven't you got gumption enough not to drink swamp water or fall down and scream whenever you have a little colic or feel a mosquito bite you? He made me a little mad. You've got the bedside manners of a Paiute medicine man, says I, and I wish you'd go away and let me die a natural death. I'm sorry I sent for you. I've a mind to, says George, for nobody cares whether you live or die. But now I've been tricked into coming. I might as well stay until this little attack of indigestion or nettle rash or whatever it is passes away. 2 weeks afterward, when I was beginning to get around again, the doctor laughed and said he was sure that my friends keeping me mad all the time did more than his drugs to cure me. So that's the way George and me was friends. There wasn't any sentiment about it. It was just give and take, and each of us knew that the other was ready for the call at any time. I remember once, I played a sort of joke on George, just to try him. I felt a little mean about it afterward, because I never ought to have doubted he'd do it. We was both living in a little town in the San Luis Valley, running some flocks of sheep and a few cattle. We were partners, but, as usual, we didn't live together. I had an old aunt, out from the east, visiting for the summer, so I rented a little cottage. She soon had a couple of cows and some pigs and chickens to make the place look like home. George lived alone in a little cabin half a mile out of town. One day a calf that we had died. That night I broke its bones, dumped it into a coarse sack and tied it up with wire. I put on an old shirt, tore a sleeve most out of it, and the collar half off, tangled up my hair, put some red ink on my hands and splashed some of it over my shirt and face. I must have looked like I'd been having the fight of my life. I put the sack in a wagon and drove out to George's cabin. When I helloed, he came out in a yellow dressing gown, a Turkish cap and patent leather shoes. George always was a great dresser. I dumped the bundle to the ground. SHSH, says I, kind of wild in my way. Take that and bury it, George. Out somewhere behind your house, bury it just like it is. And Dawn. Don't get excited, says George. And for the Lord's sake go and wash your hands and face and put on a clean shirt. And he lights his pipe, while I drive away at a gallop. The next morning he drops around to our cottage, where my aunt was fiddling with her flowers and truck in the front yard. He bends himself and bows and makes compliments as be could do, when so disposed, and begs a rose bush from her, saying he had turned up a little land back of his cabin and wanted to plant something on it by way of usefulness and ornament. So my aunt, flattered, pulls up one of her biggest by the roots and gives it to him. Afterward I see it growing where he planted it, in a place where the grass had been cleared off and the dirt leveled. But neither George nor me ever spoke of it to each other again. The moon rose higher, possibly drawing water from the sea, pixies from their dells, and certainly more confidences from Sims Bell, the friend of a friend. There come a time, Not long afterward, he went on, when I was able to do a good turn for George Ringo. George had made a little pile of money in beeves and he was up in Denver, and he showed up when I saw him, wearing deerskin vests, yellow shoes, clothes like the awnings in front of drugstores, and his hair dyed so blue that it looked black in the dark. He wrote me to come up there, quick that he needed me, and to bring the best outfit of clothes I had. I had him on when I got the letter, so I left on the next train. George was. Belle stopped for half a minute, listening intently. I thought I heard a team coming down the road, he explained. George was at a summer resort on a lake near Denver and was putting on as many airs as he knew how. He had rented a little two-room cottage and had a chihuahua dog and a hammock and 8 different kinds of walking sticks. Sims, he says to me, there's a widow woman here that's pestering the soul out of me with her intentions. I can't get out of her way. It ain't that she ain't handsome and agreeable, in a sort of style, but her attentions is serious, and I ain't ready for to marry nobody and settle down. I can't go to no festivity nor sit on the hotel piazza or mix in any of the society roundups, but what she cuts me out of the herd and puts her daily brand on me. I like this here place, goes on George, and I'm making a hit here in the most censorious circles, so I don't want to have to run away from it. So I sent for you. What do you want me to do? I asks George. Why, says he, I want you to head her off. I want you to cut me out. I want you to come to the rescue. Suppose you seen a wildcat about for to eat me, what would you do? Go for it, says I. Correct, says George. Then go for this Mrs. de Clinton the same. How am I to do it? I asks. By force and awfulness, or in some gentler and less lurid manner. Court her, George says, get her off my trail. Feed her. Take her out in boats. Hang around her, and stick to her. Get her mashed on you if you can. Some women are pretty big fools. Who knows but what she might take a fancy to you? Had you ever thought, I asks, of repressing your fatal fascinations in her presence? Of squeezing a harsh note in the melody of your siren voice? Of veiling your beauty, other words, of giving her the bounce yourself? George sees no essence of sarcasm in my remark. He twists his mustache and looks at the points of his shoes. Well, Sims, he said, you know how I am about the ladies. I can't hurt none of their feelings. I'm, by nature, polite and esteemful of their intents and purposes. This Mrs. de Clinton don't appear to be the suitable sort for me. Besides, I ain't a marrying man by all means. All right, said I, I'll do the best I can in the case. So I bought a new outfit of clothes and a book on etiquette and made a dead set for Mrs. de Clinton. She was a fine-looking woman, cheerful and gay. At first, I almost had to hobble her to keep her from loping around at George's heels, but finally I got her so she seemed glad to go riding with me and sailing on the lake, and she seemed real hurt on the mornings when I forgot to send her a bunch of flowers. Still, I didn't like the way she looked at George, sometimes, out of the corner of her eye. George was having a fine time now, going with the whole bunch just as he pleased. Yes'm, continued Belle, she certainly was a fine-looking woman at that time. She's changed some since, as you might have noticed at the supper table. What? I exclaimed. I married Mrs. de Clinton, went on Belle, one evening while we were up at the lake. When I told George about it, he opened his mouth and I thought he was going to break our traditions and say something grateful, but he swallowed it back. All right, says he, playing with his dog. I hope you won't have too much trouble. Myself, I'm not never going to marry. That was 3 years ago, said Belle. We came here to live. For a year we got along medium fine, and then everything changed. For 2 years I've been having something that rhymes first class with my name. You heard the row upstairs this evening? That was a merry welcome compared to the usual average. She's tired of me and of this little town life, and she rages all day, like a panther in a cage. I stood it until 2 weeks ago, and then I had to send out the call. I located George in Sacramento. He started the day he got my wire. Mrs. Bell came out of the house swiftly toward us. Some strong excitement or anxiety seemed to possess her, but she smiled a faint hostess smile and tried to keep her voice calm. The dew is falling, she said, and it's growing rather late. Wouldn't you gentlemen rather come into the house? Bell took some cigars from his pocket and answered, It's most too fine a night to turn in yet. I think Mr. Ames and I will walk out along the road a mile or so and have another smoke. I want to talk with him about some goods that I want to buy." "Up the road or down the road?" asked Mrs. Bell. "Down," said Belle. I thought she breathed a sigh of relief. When we had gone 100 yards and the house became concealed by trees, Belle guided me into the thick grove that lined the road and back through them toward the house again. We stopped within 20 yards of the house, concealed by the dark shadows. I wondered at this maneuver, and then I heard in the distance, coming down the road beyond the house, the regular hoofbeats of a team of horses. Belle held his watch in a ray of moonlight. "On time, within a minute," he said. "That's George's way." The team slowed up as it drew near the house and stopped in a patch of black shadows. We saw the figure of a woman carrying a heavy valise move swiftly from the other side of the house and hurry to the waiting vehicle. Then it rolled away briskly in the direction from which it had come. I looked at Belle inquiringly, I suppose. I certainly asked him no question. "She's running away with George," said Belle, simply. "He's kept me posted about the progress of the scheme all along. She'll get a divorce in 6 months, and then George will marry her. He never helps anybody halfway. It's all arranged between them." I began to wonder what friendship was, after all. When we went into the house, Belle began to talk easily on other subjects, and I took his cue. By and by, the big chance to buy out the business in Mountain City came back to my mind, and I began to urge it upon him. Now that he was free, it would be easier for him to make the move, and he was sure of a splendid bargain. Belle was silent for some minutes, but when I looked at him, I fancied that he was thinking of something else, that he was not considering the project. "Why, no, Mr. Ames," he said, after a while, "I can't make that deal. I'm awful thankful to you, though, for telling me about it. But I've got to stay here. I can't go to Mountain City." "Why?" I asked. "Mrs. Bell," he replied, "won't live in Mountain City. She hates the place and wouldn't go there. I've got to keep right on here in Saltillo." "Mrs. Bell," I exclaimed, too puzzled to conjecture what he meant. "I ought to explain," said Belle. "I know George and I know Mrs. Bell. He's impatient in his ways. He can't stand things that fret him long, like I can. 6 months, I give them 6 months of married life, and there'll be another disunion. Mrs. Bell will come back to me. There's no other place for her to go. I've got to stay here and wait. At the end of 6 months, I'll have to grab a satchel and catch the first train, for George will be sending out the call. The 4th in Salvador." By O. Henry. On a summer's day, while the city was rocking with the din and red uproar of patriotism, Billy Casparis told me this story. In his way, Billy is Ulysses, Jr. like Satan. He comes from going to and fro upon the earth and walking up and down in it. Tomorrow morning, while you are cracking your breakfast egg, he may be off with his little alligator grip to boom a town site in the middle of Lake Okeechobee or to trade horses with the Patagonians. We sat at a little, round table, and between us were glasses holding big lumps of ice, and above us leaned an artificial palm. And because our scene was set with the properties of the one they recalled to his mind, Billy was stirred to narrative. "It reminds me," said he, "of a 4th I helped to celebrate down in Salvador. 'Twas while I was running an ice factory down there. After I unloaded that silver mine I had in Colorado, I had what they called a conditional concession. They made me put up $1,000 cash forfeit that I would make ice continuously for 6 months. If I did that, I could draw down my ante. If I failed to do so, the government took the pot. So the inspectors kept dropping in, trying to catch me without the goods. One day when the thermometer was at 110, the clock at 1:30, and the calendar at July 3rd, 2 of the little, brown, oily nosers in red trousers slid in to make an inspection. Now, the factory hadn't turned out a pound of ice in 3 weeks, for a couple of reasons. The Salvador heathen wouldn't buy it. They said it make things cold, they put it in. And I couldn't make any more, because I was broke. All I was holding on for was to get down my 1,000, so I could leave the country. The 6 months would be up on the 6th of July. Well, I showed him all the ice I had. I raised the lid of a darkish vat, and there was an elegant 100-pound block of ice, beautiful and convincing to the eye. I was about to close down the lid again when one of those brunette sleuths flops down on his red knees and lays a slanderous and violent hand on my guarantee of good faith. And in 2 minutes more they had dragged out on the floor that fine chunk of molded glass that had cost me $50 to have shipped down from Frisco. "Ice why?" says the fellow that played me the dishonorable trick. "Very warm ice why?" "Yes." "The day is that hot, senor?" "Yes." "Maybe so it is of desirableness to leave him out to get the cool." "Yes." "Yes," says I, "yes," for I knew they had me. Touching's believing, ain't it, boys? Yes. Now there's some might say the seats of your trousers are sky blue, but 'tis my opinion they are red. Let's apply the tests of the laying on of hands and feet. And so I hoisted both those inspectors out the door on the toe of my shoe, and sat down to cool off on my block of disreputable glass. And as I live without oats, while I sat there, homesick for money and without a cent to my ambition, there came on the breeze the most beautiful smell my nose had entered for a year. God knows where it came from in that backyard of a country. Was a bouquet of soaked lemon peel, cigar stumps, and stale beer, exactly the smell of Goldbrick Charlie's place on 14th Street where I used to play pinochle of afternoons with the third-rate actors. And that smell drove my troubles through me and clinched him at the back. I began to long for my country and feel sentiments about it. And I said words about Salvador that you wouldn't think could come legitimate out of an ice factory. And while I was sitting there, down through the blazing sunshine in his clean, white clothes comes Maximilian Jones, an American interested in rubber and rosewood. "Great carambos," says I, when he stepped in, for I was in a bad temper. Didn't I have catastrophes enough? "I know what you want. You want to tell me that story again about Johnny Amager and the widow on the train. You've told it 9 times already this month." "It must be the heat," says Jones, stopping in at the door, amazed. "Poor Billy. He's got bugs. Sitting on ice, and calling his best friends pseudonyms. Hi, slash muchacho slash." Jones called my force of employees, who was sitting in the sun, playing with his toes, and told him to put on his trousers and run for the doctor. "Come back," says I. "Sit down, Maxie, and forget it. 'Tis not ice you see, nor a lunatic upon it. 'Tis only an exile full of homesickness sitting on a lump of glass that's just cost him $1,000. Now, what was it Johnny said to the widow first? I'd like to hear it again, Maxie, honest. Don't mind what I said." Maximilian Jones and I sat down and talked. He was about as sick of the country as I was, for the grafters were squeezing him for half the profits of his rosewood and rubber. Down in the bottom of a tank of water I had a dozen bottles of sticky Frisco beer, and I fished these up, and we fell to talking about home and the flag and Hail Columbia and home fried potatoes. And the drivel we contributed would have sickened any man enjoying those blessings. But at that time we were out of him. You can't appreciate home till you've left it, money till it's spent, your wife till she's joined a woman's club, nor Old Glory till you see it hanging on a broomstick on the shanty of a consul in a foreign town. And sitting there me and Maximilian Jones, scratching at our prickly heat and kicking at the lizards on the floor, became afflicted with a dose of patriotism and affection for our country. There was me, Billy Casparis, reduced from a capitalist to a pauper by over-addiction to my glass, in the lump, declares my troubles off for the present and myself to be an uncrowned sovereign of the greatest country on earth. And Maximilian Jones pours out whole drug stores of his wrath on oligarchies and potentates in red trousers and calico shoes. And we issues a declaration of interference in which we guarantee that the 4th day of July shall be celebrated in Salvador with all the kinds of salutes, explosions, honors of war, oratory, and liquids known to tradition. Yes, neither me nor Jones breathed with souls so dead. There shall be rucuses in Salvador, we say, and the monkeys had better climb the tallest coconut trees, and the fire department get out its red sashes and 2 tin buckets. About this time into the factory steps a native man incriminated by the name of General Mary Esperanza Dingo. He was some pumpkin both in politics and color, and the friend of me and Jones. He was full of politeness and a kind of intelligence, having picked up the latter and managed to preserve the former during a 2 years' residence in Philadelphia studying medicine. For a Salvadorian he was not such a calamitous little man, though he always would play jack, queen, king, ace, deuce for a straight. General Mary sits with us and has a bottle. While he was in the States he had acquired a synopsis of the English language and the art of admiring our institutions. By and by the general gets up and tiptoes to the doors and windows and other stage entrances, remarking hist at each one. They all do that in Salvador before they ask for a drink of water or the time of day, being conspirators from the cradle and matinee idols by proclamation. Hist, says General Dingo again, and then he lays his chest on the table quite like Gaspard the miser. Good friends, señores, tomorrow will be the great day of liberty and independence. The hearts of Americans and Salvadorians should beat together. Of your history and your great Washington I know. Is it not so? Now, me and Jones thought that nice of the general to remember when the 4th came. It made us feel good. He must have heard the news going round in Philadelphia about that disturbance we had with England. Yes, says me and Maxie together. We knew it. We were talking about it when you came in, and you can bet your bottom concession that there'll be fuss and feathers in the air tomorrow. We are few in numbers, but the welkin may as well reach out to push the button, for it's got to ring. I, too, shall assist, says the general, thumping his collarbone. I, too, am on the side of liberty. Noble Americans, we will make the day one to be never forgotten. For us American whiskey, says Jones, none of your Scotch smoke or anisada or 3-star Hennessy tomorrow. We'll borrow the consul's flag. Old man Billfinger shall make orations, and we'll have a barbecue on the plaza. Fireworks, says I, will be scarce, but we'll have all the cartridges in the shops for our guns. I've got 2 Navy 6s I brought from Denver. There is 1 cannon, said the general, 1 big cannon that will go boom, and 300 men with rifles to shoot. Oh, say, says Jones Generalissimo, you're the real silk elastic. We'll make it a joint international celebration. Please, General, get a white horse and a blue sash and be Grand Marshal. With my sword, says the general, rolling his eyes. I shall ride at the head of the brave men who gather in the name of liberty. And you might, we suggest, see the commandante and advise him that we are going to prize things up a bit. We Americans, you know, are accustomed to using municipal regulations for gun wadding when we line up to help the eagle scream. He might suspend the rules for one day. We don't want to get in the calaboose for spanking his soldiers if they get in our way. Do you see? Hist, says General Mary. The commandant is with us, heart and soul. He will aid us. He is one of us. We made all the arrangements that afternoon. There was a buck coon from Georgia and Salvador who had drifted down there from a busted-up colored colony that had been started on some possumless land in Mexico. As soon as he heard us say barbecue, he wept for joy and groveled on the ground. He dug his trench on the plaza and got half a beef on the coals for an all-night roast. Me and Maxie went to see the rest of the Americans in the town, and they all sizzled like a sedlets with joy at the idea of solemnizing an old-time 4th. There were 6 of us all together: Martin Dillard, a coffee planter, Henry Barnes, a railroad man, Old Man Billfinger, an educated tintype taker, me and Jonesy and Jerry, the boss of the barbecue. There was also an Englishman in town named Starrett, who was there to write a book on domestic architecture of the insect world. We felt some bashfulness about inviting a Britisher to help crow over his own country, but we decided to risk it out of our personal regard for him. We found Starrett in pajamas working at his manuscript with a bottle of brandy for a paperweight. Englishman, says Jones, let us interrupt your disquisition on bug houses for a moment. Tomorrow is the 4th of July. We don't want to hurt your feelings, but we're going to commemorate the day when we licked you by a little refined debauchery and nonsense, something that can be heard above 5 miles off. If you are broad-gauged enough to taste whiskey at your own wake, we'd be pleased to have you join us. Do you know, says Starrett, setting his glasses on his nose, I like your cheek in asking me if I'll join you. Blast me if I don't. You might have known I would, without asking. Not as a traitor to my own country, but for the intrinsic joy of a blooming row. On the morning of the 4th, I woke up in that old shanty of an ice factory feeling sore. I looked around at the wreck of all I possessed, and my heart was full of bile. From where I lay on my cot, I could look through the window and see the consul's old ragged stars and stripes hanging over his shack. You're all kinds of a fool, Billy Casparis, I said to myself. And of all your crimes against sense, it does look like this idea of celebrating the 4th should receive the award of demerit. Your business is busted up, your $1,000 has gone into the kitty of this corrupt country on that last bluff you made. You've got just 15 chili dollars left, worth 46 cents each at bedtime last night and steadily going down. Today you'll blow in your last, sent hurrahing for that flag. And tomorrow you'll be living on bananas from the stalk and screwing your drinks out of your friends. What's the flag done for you? While you were under it, you worked for what you got. You wore your fingernails down skinning suckers and salting mines and driving bears and alligators off your town lot additions. How much does patriotism count for on deposit with the little man with the green eye shade in the savings bank adds up your book? Suppose you were to get pinched over here in this irreligious country for some little crime or other and appeal to your country for protection, what would it do for you? Turn your appeal over to a committee of one railroad man, an army officer, a member of each labor union, and a colored man to investigate whether any of your ancestors were ever related to a cousin of Mark Hanna, and then file the papers in the Smithsonian Institution until after the next election. That's the kind of a sidetrack the stars and stripes would switch you onto. You can see that I was feeling like an indigo plant, but after I washed my face in some cool water and got out my navies and ammunition and started up to the saloon of the Immaculate Saints where we were to meet, I felt better. And when I saw those other American boys come swaggering into the trysting place, cool, easy, conspicuous fellows, ready to risk any kind of a one-card draw, or to fight grizzlies, fire, or extradition, I began to feel glad I was one of them. So, I says to myself again, Billy, you've got $15 in a country left this morning, blow in the dollars and blow up the town as an American gentleman should on Independence Day. It is my recollection that we began the day along conventional lines. The six of us for Starrett was a long-made progress among the cantinas, divesting the bars as we went of all strong drink bearing American labels. We kept informing the atmosphere as to the glory and preeminence of the United States and its ability to subdue, outjump, and eradicate the other nations of the earth. And, as the findings of American labels grew more plentiful, we became more contaminated with patriotism. Maximilian Jones hopes that our late foe, Mr. Starrett, will not take offense at our enthusiasm. He sets down his bottle and shakes Starrett's hand. As white man to white man, says he, denude our uproar of the slightest taint of personality. Excuse us for Bunker Hill, Patrick Henry, and Waldorf Astor, and such grievances as might lie between us as nations. Fellow hoodlums, says Starrett, on behalf of the Queen I ask you to cheese it. It is an honor to be a guest at disturbing the peace under the American flag. Let us chant the passionate strains of Yankee Doodle, while the senor behind the bar mitigates the occasion with another round of cochineal and aquafortis. Old man Billfinger, being charged with a kind of rhetoric, makes speeches every time we stop. We explained to such citizens as we happened to step on that we were celebrating the dawn of our own private brand of liberty, and to please enter such inhumanities as we might commit on the list of unavoidable casualties. About 11 o'clock, our bulletins read, a considerable rise in temperature, accompanied by thirst and other alarming symptoms. We hooked arms and stretched our line across the narrow streets, all of us armed with Winchesters and navies for purposes of noise and without malice. We stopped on a street corner and fired a dozen or so rounds, and began a serial assortment of United States whoops and yells, probably the first ever heard in that town. When we made that noise, things began to liven up. We heard a pattering up a side street, and here came General Mary Esperanza Dingo on a white horse with a couple of 100 brown boys following him in red undershirts and bare feet, dragging guns 10 feet long. Jones and me had forgot all about General Mary and his promise to help us celebrate. We fired another salute and gave another yell, while the general shook hands with us and waved his sword. "Oh, General," shouts Jones, "this is great. This will be a real pleasure to the Eagle. Get down and have a drink." "Drink?" says the general. "No, there is no time to drink. /vive la libertad / Don't forget /e pluribus unum / says Henry Barnes. /viva /it good and strong, says I. Likewise, /viva /George Washington, God save the Union, and I says, bowing to Starrett, don't discard the Queen. "Thanks," says Starrett. "The next round's mine. All into the bar. Army, too." But we were deprived of Sterrett's treat by a lot of gunshots several squares sway, which General Dingo seemed to think he ought to look after. He spurred his old white plug up that way, and the soldiers scuttled along after him. Mary is a real tropical bird, says Jones. He's turned out the infantry to help us to honor to the 4th. We'll get that cannon he spoke of after a while, and fire some window breakers with it. But just now I want some of that barbecued beef. Let us on to the plaza. There we found the meat gloriously done, and Jerry waiting, anxious. We sat around on the grass, and got hunks of it on our tin plates. Maximilian Jones, always made tender-hearted by drink, cried some because George Washington couldn't be there to enjoy the day. There was a man I love, Billy, he says, weeping on my shoulder. Poor George, to think he's gone, and missed the fireworks. A little more salt, please, Jerry. From what we could hear, General Dingo seemed to be kindly contributing some noise while we feasted. There were guns going off around town, and pretty soon we heard that cannon go boom, just as he said it would. And then men began to skin along the edge of the plaza, dodging in among the orange trees and houses. We certainly had things stirred up in Salvador. We felt proud of the occasion and grateful to General Dingo. Sterrett was about to take a bite off a juicy piece of rib when a bullet took it away from his mouth. Somebody's celebrating with ball cartridges, says he, reaching for another piece. Little overzealous for a non-resident patriot, isn't it? Don't mind it, I says to him. 'Twas an accident. They happen, on the 4th. After one reading of the Declaration of Independence in New York, I've known the SRO sign to be hung out at all the hospitals and police stations. But then Jerry gives a howl and jumps up with one hand clapped to the back of his leg where another bullet has acted overzealous. And then comes a quantity of yells, and round a corner and across the plaza gallops General Mary Esperanza Dingo embracing the neck of his horse, with his men running behind him, mostly dropping their guns by way of discharging ballast. And chasing him all is a company of feverish little warriors wearing blue trousers and caps. Assistance, amigos, the general shouts, trying to stop his horse. Assistance, in the name of liberty. That's the Campania Azul, the president's bodyguard, says Jones. What a shame. They've jumped on poor old Mary just because he was helping us to celebrate. Come on, boys, it's our 4th. Do we let that little squad of ATs break it up? I vote no, says Martin Dillard, gathering his Winchester. It's the privilege of an American citizen to drink, drill, dress up, and be dreadful on the 4th of July, no matter whose country he's in. Fellow citizens, says old man Billfinger, in the darkest hour of freedom's birth, when our brave forefathers promulgated the principles of undying liberty, they never expected that a bunch of blue jays like that should be allowed to bust up an anniversary. Let us preserve and protect the Constitution. We made it unanimous, and then we gathered our guns and assaulted the blue troops in force. We fired over their heads, and then charged them with a yell, and they broke and ran. We were irritated at having our barbecue disturbed, and we chased them a quarter of a mile. Some of them we caught and kicked hard. The general rallied his troops and joined in the chase. Finally, they scattered in a thick banana grove, and we couldn't flush a single one, so we sat down and rested. If I were to be put, severe, through the 3rd degree, I wouldn't be able to tell much about the rest of the day. I mind that we pervaded the town considerable, calling upon the people to bring out more armies for us to destroy. I remember seeing a crowd somewhere, and a tall man that wasn't Billfinger making a 4th of July speech from a balcony. And that was about all. Somebody must have hauled the old ice factory up to where I was, and put it around me, for there's where I was when I woke up the next morning. As soon as I could recollect by name and address, I got up and held an inquest. My last cent was gone. I was all in. And then a neat black carriage drives to the door, and out steps General Dingo and a bay man in a silk hat and tan shoes. Yes, says I to myself, I see it now. You're the Chief de Policios and High Lord Chamberlain of the Calaboosum, and you want Billy Casparis for excess of patriotism and assault with intent. All right, might as well be in jail anyhow. But it seems that General Mary is smiling, and the bay man shakes my hand and speaks in the American dialect. General Dingo has informed me, Senor Casparis, of your gallant service in our cause. I desire to thank you with my person. The bravery of you and the other señores Americanos turned the struggle for liberty in our favor. Our party triumphed. The terrible battle will live forever in history. Battle? Says I. What battle? And I ran my mind back along history, trying to think. Senor Casparis is modest, says General Dingo. He led his brave compadres into the thickest of the fearful conflict. Yes, without their aid the revolution would have failed. Why, now, says I, don't tell me there was a revolution yesterday. That was only a fourth of. But right there I abbreviated. It seemed to me it might be best. After the terrible struggle, says the Bay Man, President Bolano was forced to fly. Today Caballo is president by proclamation. Ah, yes. Beneath the new administration I am the head of the Department of Mercantile Concessions. On my file I find one report, Senor Casparis, that you have not made ice in accord with your contract. And here the Bay Man smiles at me. Cute. Oh well, says I guess the report's straight. I know they caught me. That's all there is to it. Do not say so, says the Bay Man. He pulls off a glove and goes over and lays his hand on that chunk of glass. Ice, says he, nodding his head, solemn. General Dingo also steps over and feels of it. Ice, says the general, I'll swear to it. If Senor Casparis, says the Bay Man, will present himself to the treasury on the 6th day of this month, he will receive back the $1,000 he did deposit as a forfeit. Adios, senor. The general and the Bay Man bowed themselves out, and I bowed as often as they did. And when the carriage rolls away through the sand I bows once more, deeper than ever, till my hat touches the ground. But this time, 'twas not intended for them. For, over their heads, I saw the old flag fluttering in the breeze above the consul's roof, and 'twas to it I made my profoundest salute. The Foreign Policy of Company 99 by O. Henry. John Burns, hose-cart driver of Engine Company No. 99, was afflicted with what his comrades called Japanitis. Burns had a war map spread permanently upon a table in the second story of the engine house, and he could explain to you at any hour of the day or night the exact positions, conditions, and intentions of both the Russian and Japanese armies. He had little clusters of pins stuck in the map which represented the opposing forces, and these he moved about from day to day in conformity with the war news in the daily papers. Wherever the Japs won a victory, John Burns would shift his pins, and then he would execute a war dance of delight, and the other firemen would hear him yell, "Go it, you blamed little, sawed-off, huckleberry-eyed, monkey-faced hot tamales. Eat him up, you little sleight-o-hand, bow-legged bull terriers, give him another of them yalu lulus, and you'll eat rice in St. Petersburg. Talk about your Russians, say. Wouldn't they give you a paint sky when it comes to a Scrapovich?" Not even on the fair island of Nippon was there a more enthusiastic champion of the Mikado's men. Supporters of the Russian cause did well to keep clear of Engine House No. 99. Sometimes all thoughts of the Japs left John Burns's head. That was when the alarm of fire had sounded and he was strapped in his driver's seat on the swaying cart, guiding Erebus and Joe, the finest team in the whole department according to the crew of 99. Of all the codes adopted by man for regulating his actions toward his fellow mortals, the greatest are these: the code of King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table, the Constitution of the United States, and the unwritten rules of the New York Fire Department. The Round Table methods are no longer practicable since the invention of streetcars and breach of promise suits, and our Constitution is being found more and more unconstitutional every day. So the code of our firemen must be considered in the lead, with the Golden Rule and Jeffries's new punch trying for place and show. The Constitution says that one man is as good as another, but the fire department says he is better. This is a too generous theory, but the law will not allow itself to be construed otherwise, all of which comes perilously near to being a paradox and commends itself to the attention of the SPCA. One of the transatlantic liners dumped out at Ellis Island a lump of protozoa which was expected to evolve into an American citizen. A steward kicked him down the gangway. A doctor pounced upon his eyes like a raven, seeking for trachoma or ophthalmia. He was hustled ashore and ejected into the city in the name of liberty, perhaps, theoretically, thus inoculating against kingocracy with a drop of its own virus. This hypodermic injection of Europeanism wandered happily into the veins of the city with the broad grin of a pleased child. It was not burdened with baggage, cares, or ambitions. Its body was lithely built and clothed in a sort of foreign fustian. Its face was brightly vacant, with a small, flat nose, and was mostly covered by a thick, ragged, curling beard like the coat of a spaniel. In the pocket of the imported thing were a few coins, denarii, scudikopex, pfennigs, pilasters, whatever the financial nomenclature of his unknown country may have been. Prattling to himself, always broadly grinning, pleased by the roar and movement of the barbarous city into which the steamship cut-rates had shunted him, the alien strayed away from the sea, which he hated, as far as the district covered by Engine Company number 99. Light as a cork, he was kept bobbing along by the human tide, the crudest atom in all the silt of the stream that emptied into the reservoir of liberty. While crossing 3rd Avenue, he slowed his steps, enchanted by the thunder of the elevated trains above him and the soothing crash of the wheels on the cobbles. And then there was a new, delightful chord in the uproar, the musical clanging of a gong and a great shining juggernaut belching fire and smoke that people were hurrying to see. This beautiful thing, entrancing to the eye, dashed past, and the protoplasmic immigrant stepped into the wake of it with his broad, enraptured, uncomprehending grin, and so stepped into the path of number 99's flying hose cart, with John Burns gripping, with arms of steel, the reins over the plunging backs of Erebus and Joe. The unwritten constitutional code of the firemen has no exceptions or amendments. It is a simple thing, as simple as the rule of 3. There was the heedless unit in the right-of-way. There was the hose cart and the iron pillar of the elevated railroad. John Burns swung all his weight and muscle on the left rein. The team and cart swerved that way and crashed like a torpedo into the pillar. The men on the cart went flying like skittles. The driver's strap burst, the pillar rang with the shock, and John Burns fell on the car track with a broken shoulder 20 feet away, while Erebus beautiful, raven black, best-loved Erebus lay wickering in his harness with a broken leg. In consideration for the feelings of Engine Company number 99, the details will be lightly touched. The company does not like to be reminded of that day. There was a great crowd and hurry calls were sent in. And while the ambulance gong was clearing the way, the men of number 99 heard the crack of the S.P.C.E.A. agent's pistol and turned their heads away, not daring to look toward Erebus again. When the firemen got back to the engine house, they found that one of them was dragging by the collar the cause of their desolation and grief. They set it in the middle of the floor and gathered grimly about it. Through its whiskers, the calamitous object chattered effervescently and waved its hands. "Sounds like a Sedlitz powder," said Mike Dowling, disgustedly, "and it makes me sicker than one. Call that a man? That hoss was worth a steamer full of such two-legged animals. It's an immigrant, that's what it is." "Look at the doctor's chalk mark on its coat," said Riley, the desk man. "It's just landed. It must be a kind of a Dago or a Hun or one of them Finns, I guess. That's the kind of truck that Europe unloads onto us. Think of a thing like that getting in the way and laying John up in hospital and spoiling the best fire team in the city," groaned another fireman. "It ought to be taken down to the dock and drowned." "Somebody go around and get Sloviski," suggested the engine driver, "and let's see what nation is responsible for this conglomeration of hair and head noises." Sloviski kept a delicatessen store around the corner on 3rd Avenue and was reputed to be a linguist. One of the men fetched him a fat, cringing man with a discursive eye and the odors of many kinds of meats upon him. "Take a whirl at this importation with your jawbreakers, Sloviski," requested Mike Dowling. "We can't quite figure out whether he's from the Hackensack Bottoms or Hong Kong on the Ganges." Sloviski addressed the stranger in several dialects that ranged in rhythm and cadence from the sounds produced by a tonsillitis gargle to the opening of a can of tomatoes with a pair of scissors. The immigrant replied in accents resembling the uncorking of a bottle of ginger ale. "I have you his name," reported Sloviski. "You shall not pronounce it. Writing of it in paper is better." They gave him paper, and he wrote, "Demetresvangsk." "Looks like shorthand," said the desk man. "He speaks some language," continued the interpreter, wiping his forehead, "of Austria and mixed with a little Turkish. And din, he have some Magyar words and a Polish or two, and many like the Romanian, but not without talk of one tribe in Bessarabia. I do not him quite understand. Would you call him a Dago or a Polacker, or what? Asked Mike, frowning at the polyglot description. He is a, answered Sloviski. He is a I dink he come from I dink he is a fool, he concluded, impatient at his linguistic failure. And if you pleases I will go back at mine delicatessen. Whatever he is, he's a bird, said Mike Dowling, and you want to watch him fly. Taking by the wing the alien fowl that had fluttered into the nest of liberty, Mike led him to the door of the engine house and bestowed upon him a kick hearty enough to convey the entire animus of Company 99. Demetre Svangsk hustled away down the sidewalk, turning once to show his ineradicable grin to the aggrieved fireman. In 3 weeks John Burns was back at his post from the hospital. With great gusto he proceeded to bring his war map up to date. My money on the Japs every time, he declared. Why, look at them Russians, nothing but wolves. Wipe 'em out, I say, and the little old jiu-jitsu gang are just the cherry blossoms to do the trick, and don't you forget it. The second day after Burns's reappearance came Demetre Svangsk, the unidentified, to the engine house, with a broader grin than ever. He managed to convey the idea that he wished to congratulate the hose cart driver on his recovery and to apologize for having caused the accident. This he accomplished by so many extravagant gestures and explosive noises that the company was diverted for half an hour. Then they kicked him out again, and on the next day he came back grinning. How or where he lived no one knew. And then John Burns's 9-year-old son, Chris, who brought him convalescent delicacies from home to eat, took a fancy to Svangsk, and they allowed him to loaf about the door of the engine house occasionally. One afternoon the big drab automobile of the deputy fire commissioner buzzed up to the door of number 99, and the deputy stepped inside for an informal inspection. The men kicked Svangsk out a little harder than usual and proudly escorted the deputy around 99, in which everything shone like my lady's mirror. The deputy respected the sorrow of the company concerning the loss of Erebus, and he had come to promise it another mate for Joe that would do him credit. So they let Joe out of his stall and showed the deputy how deserving he was of the finest mate that could be in Horsedom. While they were circling around Joe confabbing, Chris climbed into the deputy's auto and threw the power full on. The men heard a monster puffing and a shriek from the lad, and sprang out too late. The big auto shot away, luckily taking a straight course down the street. The boy knew nothing of its machinery. He sat clutching the cushions and howling. With the power on, nothing could have stopped that auto except a brick house, and there was nothing for Chris to gain by such a stoppage. Demetre Svangsk was just coming in again with a grin for another kick when Chris played his merry little prank. While the others sprang for the door, Demetre sprang for Joe. He glided upon the horse's bare back like a snake and shouted something at him like the crack of a dozen whips. One of the firemen afterwards swore that Joe answered him back in the same language. 10 seconds after the auto started, the big horse was eating up the asphalt behind it like a strip of macaroni. Some people 2 blocks and a half away saw the rescue. They said that the auto was nothing but a drab noise with a black speck in the middle of it for Chris, when a big bay horse with a lizard lying on its back cantered up alongside of it, and the lizard reached over and picked the black speck out of the noise. Only 15 minutes after Svangsk's last kicking at the hands, or rather the feet of engine company number 99, he rode Joe back through the door with the boy safe, but acutely conscious of the licking he was going to receive. Svangsk slipped to the floor, leaned his head against Joe's and made a noise like a clucking hen. Joe nodded and whistled loudly through his nostrils, putting to shame the knowledge of Sloviski of the delicatessen. John Burns walked up to Svangsk, who grinned, expecting to be kicked. Burns gripped the outlander so strongly by the hand that Demetre grinned anyhow, conceiving it to be a new form of punishment. "The heathen rides like a Cossack," remarked a fireman who had seen a Wild West show. "They're the greatest riders in the world." The word seemed to electrify Svangsk. He grinned wider than ever. "Yas me Cossack," he spluttered, striking his chest. "Cossack," repeated John Burns thoughtfully. "Ain't that a kind of a Russian?" "They're one of the Russian tribes, sure," said the desk man, who read books between fire alarms. Just then Alderman Foley, who was on his way home and did not know of the runaway, stopped at the door of the engine house and called to Burns. "Hello there, Jimmy. Me boy, how's the war coming along? Japs still got the bear on the trot, have they? Oh, I don't know, said John Burns argumentatively. Them Japs haven't got any walkover. You wait till Koropakin gets a good whack at him, and they won't be knee-high to a puddle ducksky.